Hi, I'm volcanologist Dr. Janine Kripner, and this is my guest.
This is Tom Casadevall. I'm with the U.S. Geological Survey here in Denver, Colorado, and formerly worked at the Mount St. Helens eruption in 1980.
Thank you so much for joining me for this special series looking back on the 40th anniversary of the Mount St. Helens eruption. An important thing that has come out of that is the Mount St. Helens National Volcanic Monument. So on a broader scale, could you tell us about the different kinds of protected volcanic landscapes around the world and within the United States, and how that relates to preserving volcanic environments?
Right. Well, the topic that we're talking about, we can consider geological heritage, and many of my colleagues in the geosciences, for many of them, this is a new field. It's a new area of pursuit. In the volcano sciences, we know that many volcanic areas lie within national parks or national monuments or preserves, and so they're protected in some way. And so a group of us within the volcanological community over the last few years have pursued the concept of protected volcanic landscapes, and we're trying to organize that concept, protected volcanic landscapes, into something that's more that we can study and organize and try to understand and compare and contrast how these protected volcanic landscapes are managed in different parts of the world. At the international level, there are really two key categories of protected volcanic landscapes. Many of our viewers will be familiar with the concept of a World Heritage Site, and there are more than 1,100 World Heritage Sites in the world. Almost 300 of those are what we call natural sites, and natural sites include being listed for their geological features, for their biological features, their ecosystems, their biodiversity. A subset of those 300 have strong volcanic features, and we refer to these as the World Heritage volcanic areas. And there are about 80 of these right now in the world. And here in the United States, we have 5 World Heritage Sites that have strong volcanic features. And for many of the viewers, you'll understand Hawaii Volcanoes National Park is a very important volcanic feature. Grand Canyon National Park, which we often think of as the World Heritage Site that has the longest recorded stratigraphic history of the Earth, also has a monogenetic cinder cone field on the north rim, the Uinkaret Field, with some very, very recent 500-year-old eruptions. A third site is the Wrangell St. Elias National Park up in Alaska with several Holocene volcanoes. There is a nature reserve in the Central Pacific called the Papahanaumokuakea Nature Reserve or Marine Reserve, and this is a part of the Emperor Hawaiian Seamount chain. And then probably the most important one, that a World Heritage Site that's a volcanic landscape in the United States, is also the first national park in the world, and that's Yellowstone, recognized for its geothermal features. So we have World Heritage Sites, and they're sort of the first international category. A second international category are the UNESCO Global Geoparks. This is a relatively new program for UNESCO. There are 140 UNESCO Global Geoparks worldwide, and 35 of these are focused on very young volcanics or volcanic products. Unfortunately, the United States withdrew from UNESCO in December of 2018, and therefore the United States is not able to be an active participant in the UNESCO Global Geopark program. But globally, these are the two, the World Heritage and the UNESCO Global Geopark program. Domestically, we also have 2 designations that are quite important. And one are our national parks and monuments. These are managed by the National Park Service. Viewers may know that we have 419 national parks and monuments in the United States. Many of these are built around geological features. Of the 419, 26 of those are focused on volcanic features or have volcanic stories as part of their landscapes. And we've already mentioned Hawaii volcanoes, Wrangell St. Elias, Papahanaumokuakana, and Yellowstone and the Grand Canyon. And there are about 24 more. There's another very important designation that gets much less attention, and that is the National Volcanic Monument designation. These monuments, there's 2 of them, and they are managed by the Department of Agriculture, the U.S. Forest Service. And one of these is located in Central Oregon. It's the Newberry Crater National Volcanic Monument. And then the one that we're here to discuss today, established in 1982, is the Mount St. Helens National Volcanic Monument. So that gives you an overview of 4 important designations, 2 of them international, World Heritage, UNESCO Global Geoparks, and then here in the United States, 2 designations, our national parks and monuments and our national volcanic monuments.
Thank you. It's so good to see so much work being done to preserve not just the volcanic landscape, but the environment and the culture and the history of these areas as well. So we have the Mount St. Helens National Volcanic Monument, which I've been there and I've worked on it myself. So can you talk to us about the benefits for volcanology in having this National Volcanic Monument?
Sure. Well, there are many reasons we can imagine to protect a volcanic landscape. They can be places that have great cultural significance and areas with great natural beauty. And in this case, we can think of Mount Fuji in Japan. Mount Fuji is a World Heritage Site. It's a very famous Holocene volcano. And it's listed as a World Heritage Site, not for the science and not for the volcanological aspects, but for the cultural aspects and the aesthetic appeal. And so it's very important for that reason. And it's ironic that before the 1980 eruption at Mount St. Helens, one of the names for Mount St. Helens was the Fuji of the Cascades. So Fuji is a protected volcanic landscape for cultural and aesthetic reasons. Some volcanoes, like Stromboli and Vesuvius in Italy, Montpellier in the Caribbean, Katmai, site of the April 1912 eruption in Alaska, and the Hawaiian volcanoes are important examples of volcanic eruptions which are used in the popular culture to typify a particular type of eruption. So we talk about Strombolian eruptions. We talk about Palaean dome collapse. We talk about Hawaiian style lava flows. And these eruptions really define some of the core concepts of volcano science. And so it's important to protect those volcanoes or their volcanic landscapes. And several of those are also listed as World Heritage Sites. Other volcanoes are very important because of the importance of the scientific studies that went into them at the time of the eruption. 3 from Indonesia that I've worked on, Toba in Sumatra, Tambora in central part of the archipelago, and a really important one is Krakatoa between the islands of Sumatra and Java in the Sunda Strait. And these eruptions were very, very well studied, somewhat at the time, but especially aftermath. And so the scientific knowledge derived from the studies of these volcanoes make them very important. And again, the importance is conserving or protecting the landscapes of those volcanoes so that in the future, people can visit them, people can understand more as we develop our scientific culture. So these are some examples of important and widely protected volcanic landscapes. And these are important not only to human history, but also to the history of the science of volcanology. For Mount St. Helens on May 18th, 1980, we were lucky in many ways. That eruption happened early on a Sunday morning. It was a clear blue sky that day with excellent visibility. Many people were out volcano watching, including several geologists who happened to be flying around the volcano and observe the eruption from the air. So it's one of the best documented and observed eruptions in modern history. Also, it was one of the volcanoes that had probably the best state-of-the-art seismic monitoring network in place at the time. And that monitoring network largely survived the eruption. And so we know with exquisite detail timing of the observed events that we can link into the seismic record. Unique features like the failure of the north flank of the volcano at 8:32 in the morning, the landslide, the lateral blast, the initial eruption column that came off of the lateral blast material, the later Plinian column that came up from the main crater itself, and the downstream mud flows were all photographed, recorded, and observed in great detail. And their characters were also recorded and linked in to the seismic record. So the heartbeat of that whole day is very well preserved. In addition, something we often forget about is that we had a new generation of meteorological weather satellites in geostationary orbit over North America. And so this was really the first eruption where we have a remarkable time-lapse sequence of images about the development and the eastward spread of the ash cloud. And these are really unique observations in modern volcanology. And finally, we had more than a dozen scientists, trained scientists on the ground that day working in Southwest Washington. Colleagues from the University of Washington, from several universities, and from the US Geological Survey. So the stage was really well set for understanding in a lot of detail what happened that day, May 18th, 1980. The amount of observational detail for that eruption was unprecedented in volcanological study. And the only other study, a modern study that I can think of, was Pliny the Elder's observations of the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD, where his son recorded in exquisite detail the observations of the Vesuvian eruption. And that led, of course, to the concept of Plinian eruption columns, understanding pyroclastic flows, and that amount of detail. Imagine where we would be today if the May 18th eruption had happened at night. Imagine if it had happened in cloudy weather. Imagine if there were no scientists there to observe it. We would still be arguing 40 years later about interpretations of what particular deposits meant. What were the physical volcanology parameters surrounding emplacement of the lateral blast, or the debris avalanche, or the surge deposits, or the pyroclastic flows? And so we were super fortunate for the conditions that morning on May 18th. Of comparable importance to the geological studies that we've talked about was the recognition of what the volcano did to that forest landscape. It was a very mature forest landscape. Parts of it were undergoing clear cutting. Even the morning of May 18th, there were loggers and foresters out to harvest timber within the area immediately adjacent to the volcano. But the eruption had a dramatic impact on the biological stage, as it were. And in many ways, it swept that stage clean right down to bedrock. And the biological recovery of the flora and fauna is an ongoing story at Mount St. Helens, and it's really the one that underpins the legal requirements for the establishment of the Mount St. Helens National Volcanic Monument. When you look at the story of how the monument was established, I'm sorry to say it's not really there for the geological features as much as it is there for the impact on the ecosystem, the flora, the fauna, and the ongoing recovery. So that's really what underpins the Mount St. Helens National Volcanic Monument. In the late 1970s, Mount St. Helens area was already recognized as being very important because of the old growth timber in the area. There was timber on the north slopes going up past Spirit Lake. That forest had never been harvested. And the Mount St. Helens Association, which was made up largely of citizen conservationists and activists in Southwest Washington, were very active in trying to promulgate establishment of a wilderness area or of a preserve there for the old growth timber. Following the 1980 eruptions, the efforts were redoubled. They were not successful in the late 70s to get anything designated. The timber companies could continue to go in. The Gifford-Pinchot National Forest continued to lease the forest for harvesting. And the citizens groups were largely not forgotten, but they were not really honored with any kind of designation. But following the 1980 eruptions, efforts were redoubled to protect that landscape. And in March of 1982, President Ronald Reagan signed the act to establish the Mount St. Helens National Volcanic Monument. And it's now established to protect more than 100,000 acres in the vicinity of the Mount St. Helens volcano. Management of the Mount St. Helens National Volcanic Monument is carried out by the National Forest, U.S. Forest Service, in the Department of Agriculture. So there's a variety of designations to conserve and protect volcanic landscapes. Mount St. Helens' unique scientific contribution to volcanology, and now to study the ongoing recovery of the surrounding landscape, the surrounding territory, make it a notable site for continued scientific study and enjoyment by the public. Thanks.
Thank you so much. It's incredible to, I grew up in New Zealand reading about this eruption, seeing the video, seeing the photographs, and then to go back all of those years later and to look at the deposits and to understand really what happened that day is such an incredible opportunity because of this preservation. So thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Janine.